There's a particular kind of person you've probably encountered without fully understanding what you were looking at. They are careful in a way that goes beyond ordinary conscientiousness. They monitor themselves constantly, not just their actions but their thoughts, their motivations, the interior landscape of who they are when nobody is watching. They live with a persistent awareness of being seen, not by the people around them, by something larger, something that does not miss anything, something that has been watching since before they had the language to understand what that meant. Most people who grew up outside of religious environments look at this person and see anxiety, or rigidity, or a kind of moral hypervigilance that seems disproportionate to ordinary life. What they are actually looking at is something considerably more complex. They are looking at a nervous system that was shaped, in its earliest and most formative years, by the psychological weight of existing under an omniscient gaze. A gaze that saw everything, judged everything, and from which nothing, not a thought, not a motive, not the hidden architecture of who you actually are, could ever be concealed. This video is not about whether God exists. That question belongs to theology and philosophy and is not what concerns us here. What concerns us is the psychology of what happens to a human being who is taught, before they have the cognitive architecture to evaluate the claim, that they are always being watched by something infinite. Because that teaching does not stay abstract. It enters the nervous system, it shapes the brain, and it produces a particular kind of person whose interior life is unlike almost anything else in human psychology. Part 1. What it actually means to fear God. The theologian Paul Washer makes a distinction that most people outside of serious religious tradition have never encountered. He draws a line between two entirely different experiences that share the same name. The first is fear as terror, the fear of a righteous judge, of consequences that cannot be escaped, of standing exposed before something that sees you completely and finds you wanting. The second is fear as reverence, something closer to what a child feels in the presence of a father they love deeply and whose opinion of them is the most important thing in the world. Not terror, not the cowering of someone expecting punishment. Something more like the profound weight of being known by someone whose estimation of you is everything. This distinction matters because it maps onto two entirely different psychological experiences that produce two entirely different kinds of people. The person shaped by fear as terror lives in a state of chronic self-surveillance. They are always monitoring, always checking, always measuring the distance between who they are and who they are supposed to be. The person shaped by fear as reverence has something different, a stable internal anchor, a relationship with an authority they trust, a framework of meaning that holds even when everything else fails. Both are called the same thing. Both are shaped by the same doctrine, but the psychological outcomes are almost opposite. Jordan Peterson approaches this from a different direction entirely and arrives at something that cuts through the theological debate completely. The fear of God, for Peterson, is not primarily about God at all. It is about the structure of reality itself. It is the recognition that the moral law is not a human invention, that you cannot twist the fabric of reality without having it snap back at you, that nothing, not a single compromise, not a single act of cowardice or dishonesty or self-betrayal ever goes unaccounted for. The fear of God in this reading is simply the lived awareness that you are not bigger than the consequences of who you choose to be. And Peterson has never, in decades as a clinical psychologist, seen anyone get away with anything at all, not even once. Part 2. What childhood does with this. Here is where the psychology becomes precise and the stakes become clear. A child cannot receive the concept of an omniscient God the way an adult can. An adult has a developed prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for abstract reasoning, for evaluating claims, for contextualizing information within a broader framework of meaning. A child does not. What a child has is an amygdala that is extraordinarily active and highly sensitive to threat, embedded in a nervous system that is still learning the most basic distinction between safe and dangerous. When a child is taught that God sees everything, every action, every thought, every hidden motive, that information does not land as theology, it lands as environmental reality. The nervous system does not process it as a concept to be evaluated. It processes it as a condition of existence to be adapted to. And the adaptation is immediate and automatic. The child begins to monitor themselves not just in front of other people, but in the privacy of their own mind. Because there is no privacy. There never was. The watcher is always there. David Rubalid's clinical work documents what this does to the developing brain over time. When teachings about sin, God's wrath, Satan, and hell are presented as continual present threats rather than theological concepts, children experience them as inescapable realities their nervous system must perpetually manage. The result is chronic fear during a sensitive period of neurological development, and research in developmental neuroscience shows that this kind of chronic fear alters how the brain's threat and regulation systems interact for years afterward. It reduces emotional flexibility. It increases anxiety and hypervigilance. It installs a pattern of black and white thinking that persists long after the original teachings have stopped. Part 3. The attachment architecture. The most psychologically significant insight in this entire conversation is one that almost nobody outside of clinical work ever encounters. Children develop their image of God through the emotional template of their earliest caregivers. Not consciously, not theologically, at the level of the nervous system. At the level where the question is not, who is God, but what does authority feel like? Is it safe? Is it consistent? Does it repair ruptures or does it punish them? Attachment research is unambiguous on this point. Children form internal working models of relationship very early in life, models that answer the questions every nervous system needs answered before it can function. Am I safe? Am I loved? Can I trust the people who have power over me? What happens when I fail? These models are forming at precisely the same moment a child is first receiving theological instruction about God, sin, judgment, and salvation. The two processes are not separate. They are happening simultaneously in the same developing brain. And because of that overlap, theology is almost never received as neutral information. It is emotionally encoded through the lens of whatever the child already knows about what authority does. This means that a child raised by caregivers who are consistent, warm, and repair relational ruptures will tend to develop a God image that is trustworthy, present, and safe to approach even in failure. And a child raised by caregivers who are unpredictable, harsh, or emotionally withholding will tend to internalize a God who is the same, volatile, easily angered, watching not to protect, but to catch. The theology might be identical. The nervous system encodes something entirely different. And those early encodings, formed before language, before doctrine, before the cognitive ability to think critically about what is being taught, they persist. Rubalid documents adults who have completely reframed their theology intellectually and still experience fear responses in worship spaces, in prayer, in any context that activates the original nervous system encoding. Because those responses were not learned through thought, they cannot be unlearned through thought alone. Part 4. When the fear becomes the architecture. Scrupulosity is a term from clinical psychology that most people have never heard and that describes something that is far more common than anyone acknowledges. It is a form of religious or moral obsessive-compulsive distress in which a person becomes consumed by the persistent fear of sinning, displeasing God, or failing to meet spiritual standards. The person who lives with scrupulosity confesses and repents and confesses again because the assurance never comes. They monitor their own thoughts for evidence of wrongdoing. They cannot pray without wondering whether the prayer itself was pure enough. They cannot experience ordinary peace because peace feels like the absence of vigilance, and the absence of vigilance feels like danger. What Rubalid identifies in his clinical work is that scrupulosity is almost always traceable to environments where faith was framed primarily around threat, punishment, and hypervigilance, rather than secure attachment and grace. The nervous system learned to equate spiritual faithfulness with constant self-surveillance. And the tragic irony is that the more seriously the person takes their faith, the more relentless the surveillance becomes. Their conscientiousness, which is a genuine moral quality, gets hijacked by a fear architecture that was installed before they were old enough to consent to it or examine it. Peterson's framework illuminates something important here. He describes walking on a very thin and narrow edge, the line between chaos and order, between dissolution and rigidity. The person shaped by healthy fear of God walks that line with awareness and humility, genuinely awake to the consequences of moral failure without being paralyzed by them. The person shaped by fear as terror cannot find the line because they are too busy watching their own feet. The hypervigilance that was meant to keep them safe keeps them from ever being fully present in their own life. They are always slightly elsewhere, monitoring, checking, measuring, never fully inhabiting the moment they are in, because the moment they are in is always potentially the moment they get something wrong. Part 5. The ones who carry it. Out of the church. There is a generation of people who grew up in religious environments and left, not because they stopped caring about meaning or morality or the questions that religion was trying to answer, but because the psychological cost of the framework they were given became too high. They carry something with them that is difficult to name. It is not faith exactly. It is not the absence of faith. It is the nervous system architecture that faith built, the hypervigilance, the self-surveillance, the residual sense of being watched, the difficulty trusting that they are not in some fundamental and hidden way failing. What Ruybelid documents and what clinical work confirms is that the body does not distinguish between leaving the church and leaving the psychological framework the church installed. You can update your beliefs entirely. You can construct a coherent, secular worldview that you genuinely hold, and still experience fear responses in contexts that activate the original encoding. Because those responses were stored in the nervous system before language, before logic, before doctrine could be critically evaluated. The body learned something that the mind has since revised, and the body does not automatically follow. This is not an argument against religious formation. It is an argument for understanding what religious formation actually does at the neurological level, at the attachment level, at the level where the brain is still plastic and the nervous system is still learning what the world is. Washer's distinction between fear as terror and fear as reverence is not just theological. It is a description of two completely different developmental outcomes. One produces a person who is genuinely awake to the weight of their choices, humbled by something larger than themselves, capable of the kind of moral seriousness that Peterson describes as the beginning of wisdom. The other produces a person whose nervous system is permanently oriented toward threat, who monitors themselves not from a place of genuine moral care, but from a place of fear that was installed before they had the cognitive architecture to examine it. Both are called the fear of God. Only one deserves the name. Final thoughts. Peterson says he has never seen anyone get away with anything, not even once. And there is something in that observation that sits outside the question of whether God is real. Because what he is describing is not divine surveillance. He is describing the structure of consequence, the way that every compromise, every self-betrayal, every act of cowardice leaves something in the fabric of who you are, the way that things unravel, the way that what goes wrong 2 years later is always traceable to a moment where something was twisted and the twisting was ignored. The fear of God at its most functional is not about a watcher. It is about an internal orientation toward the weight of your own choices, the recognition that you are not bigger than the consequences of who you decide to be, that the most significant things you will ever do will be done when nobody is watching, and that the person you become in those moments is the person you will have to live inside. That is what Peterson means by the beginning of wisdom, not the terror of punishment. The lived awareness that nothing is actually hidden, not from God necessarily, from yourself, from the record of who you are choosing to be. The people who fear God in the deepest and most psychologically healthy sense are not the ones living in constant self-surveillance and chronic shame. They are the ones who have internalized the weight of their own moral existence so completely that they carry it quietly, without needing an audience, without needing external enforcement. They are awake in the way Peterson describes, genuinely, existentially awake to what it means to be the kind of person they are. And that quality, that particular gravity, is among the rarest things you will ever encounter in another human being.